Elvis Presley spent most of his adult life in front of audiences. From the moment he appeared on television in the mid-1950s, his face was recognized everywhere. People lined up outside venues for hours just to be in the same room as him. Reporters followed his movements. Photographers waited outside whatever building he walked into. For roughly 2 decades, he was one of the most watched people in the world. But there was a version of Elvis that existed outside all of that. Not the performer, not the celebrity, not the figure that magazines wrote about. Just a man who went through ordinary days, interacted with people around him, and made decisions that nobody reported on because nobody was there to see them. The people who got closest to that version of Elvis were not fans or journalists. They were the ones who worked for him, lived near Graceland, and were present for some of the most routine parts of Elvis's daily life. In interviews he gave after Elvis died, Hodge consistently described a person who was attentive to the people around him, not in a formal or organized way, but in the way someone pays attention when they are actually present in a situation. Elvis noticed when people were struggling. He noticed when someone in the room was uncomfortable or needed something, and he usually did something about it without turning it into a moment. The Memphis Mafia, the group of friends and associates who stayed close to Elvis through most of his career, gave similar accounts. These were men who saw Elvis in environments that had nothing to do with performing. They were with him at home, on the road between cities, in hospitals, in parking lots, in diners. Their descriptions of his behavior in those settings are consistent. He was generous with his time and his money in situations where there was no benefit to him for being so. Household staff at Graceland also left behind accounts of how he treated them. Cooks, drivers, and groundskeepers who spent years working at the property described an employer who knew their names, asked about their families, and on multiple occasions helped them financially when they were going through difficult periods. Some of these accounts only became public long after his death, shared in documentaries and published memoirs. What makes these descriptions worth paying attention to is that they come from people with no particular reason to shape a positive story. Some of the same individuals who described his generosity also talked honestly about his problems, his dependence on prescription medication, his increasingly isolated lifestyle in his later years, his complicated relationships with the people around him. They were not presenting a one-sided picture. They were describing what they actually observed. Part of what shaped Elvis's private behavior goes back to where he came from. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935, and his early years were marked by financial difficulty. His family rented small homes and moved frequently. They relied on neighbors and community members during hard stretches. Elvis was aware from a young age of what it felt like to need help and not always have access to it. That awareness did not disappear when his financial situation changed. People who knew him well said he was uncomfortable with excess that had no purpose. He spent money freely, on homes, on cars, on gifts, but the spending that seemed to matter most to him personally was the kind directed at someone who needed it. Not as a transaction, not as a way to feel important, but as a straightforward response to seeing a situation he could do something about. The gap between his public image and his private behavior was not something Elvis talked about in interviews. He did not go out of his way to correct the record or explain himself. He gave interviews about his music, his faith, his family. He did not discuss his private acts of generosity because, by most accounts, he did not think of them as notable. They were just decisions he made. That is what makes the accounts from people who were actually present so significant. They fill in a part of the picture that Elvis himself never put forward. The performer was what the world got to see. The person behind that, the one who paid attention to the people around him and quietly responded to what he found, that version existed mostly out of view. And it stayed that way for a long time. Elvis Presley was wealthy for most of his adult life. By the early 1960s, he had more money than he could reasonably spend. But the way he used that money did not follow a pattern that most wealthy people follow. He did not set up a foundation. He did not hold press conferences announcing donations. He did not attach his name to buildings or programs. What he did instead was respond directly to people he encountered in his daily life, often on the spot, without planning or announcement. The accounts of these moments come from multiple sources: people who witnessed them, people who were on the receiving end, and members of his inner circle who traveled with him and watched it happen repeatedly. Taken together, they describe a consistent pattern of behavior that stretched across his entire adult life. One of the most documented categories of his private giving involved medical expenses. Elvis paid hospital bills and medical costs for people he had little or no prior connection to. In some cases, these were people he had met briefly. In others, they were connected to someone on his staff or in his circle. The amounts varied, but the circumstances were usually the same. Someone was in a difficult situation, Elvis found out about it, and he covered the cost without being asked twice and without making it a condition of anything. There are recorded instances of him walking into a dealership and buying cars for strangers. These stories have been told so many times that some people assume they are exaggerated, but multiple people present during these moments gave consistent accounts. Elvis would be at a dealership for his own purposes, notice someone looking at a car they clearly could not afford, and simply buy it for them. He did not know these people. They had not asked him for anything. He just responded to what he saw in front of him. A woman named Mentha Portis, who worked as a housekeeper, spoke in later years about the way Elvis treated the staff at Graceland. She described him as someone who was aware of what was going on in the lives of the people who worked for him. When staff members had financial problems, medical emergencies, rent issues, family crises, Elvis would find out and quietly handle it. He did not make these moments into lessons or speeches. He just dealt with the problem and moved on. There are also accounts from people who encountered him in public during unplanned moments. A family whose car had broken down on the road near Memphis, a woman at a grocery store who was short on cash, a man who had lost his wallet. In each case, the account follows a similar structure. Elvis was present, he noticed the problem, and he helped without hesitation. Most of these people did not speak publicly about what happened for years, and some never did. What is notable about the pattern is that it did not seem to depend on the size of the problem or the status of the person involved. Elvis helped people with large expenses and small ones. He helped people he would never see again and people who were part of his daily life. The response was the same either way. Red West, one of the longest-serving members of the Memphis Mafia and someone who later had a public falling out with Elvis, still described his generosity in straightforward terms when asked about it. West was not someone with a reason to present a softened version of Elvis by the time he gave most of his interviews. But on the subject of how Elvis treated ordinary people in need, his account matched what others said. It was real, it was consistent, and it was not something Elvis talked about afterward. Jerry Schilling, another close associate who spent years traveling with Elvis, made a similar observation. He noted that Elvis seemed genuinely uncomfortable when people thanked him for these acts, not because he was performing humility, but because he did not appear to think the thanks were necessary. In his mind, the situation called for a response, and he gave one. That was the end of it. This behavior was not limited to any particular period of his life. Accounts of it come from the late 1950s through the 1960s and into the 1970s. It was not something he did when things were going well and stopped when they were not. It ran through the entire span of his adult years as a constant in how he moved through the world. The people he helped were not connected by any common thread other than the fact that he happened to be present when they needed something. That, more than anything, describes the nature of his giving. It was not organized or strategic. It was simply what he did when he saw a situation he could affect. To understand why Elvis behaved the way he did with money and with people, it helps to go back to the beginning. Not to his first record or his first television appearance, but to the years before any of that existed. The years when he was just a kid in Tupelo, Mississippi, growing up in circumstances that most people who later became his fans knew very little about. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8, 1935, in a two-room house that his father Vernon built with help from family members. The house had no indoor plumbing and no insulation. It sat in a working-class neighborhood in East Tupelo, in a part of Mississippi where most families were getting by on very little. The Presleys were no different. Vernon worked various jobs, farm labor, carpentry, whatever was available, and the family income was never stable. There were periods when money was extremely tight and periods when it was almost non-existent. When Elvis was 3 years old, Vernon was convicted of altering a check and served time in prison. That left Gladys Presley alone with a young child and no reliable income. Neighbors and members of the local church community helped where they could. Gladys took in laundry and did whatever work she could find. The period of Vernon's imprisonment was one of the most difficult stretches the family went through, and Elvis was old enough to be aware that something was wrong, even if he did not fully understand what. The family moved several times during Elvis's childhood, always within the same general area of Tupelo. Each move was driven by financial necessity, finding cheaper rent, being closer to available work, or leaving a place they could no longer afford. By the time Elvis was a teenager, he had lived in multiple homes across the same small city, and he understood instinctively what financial pressure looked like in a household. What Tupelo also gave him was an understanding of how communities function when individual families cannot manage on their own. In the neighborhood where he grew up, people helped each other. A family that had extra food shared it. A neighbor with a car drove someone who needed a ride. The church was a place where people with nothing in common economically still sat together and were expected to look after one another. Elvis absorbed this as a normal part of how life worked. Gladys Presley had a significant influence on how his son thought about other people. Those who knew her described her as warm, direct, and deeply connected to the people around her. She treated people without regard to their status or what they could offer in return. Elvis was close to his mother in a way that stayed with him his entire life, and the values she modeled were ones he carried into adulthood. When the family moved to Memphis in 1948, Elvis was 13. They settled in a housing project called Lauderdale Courts, which was public housing for low-income families. The move to Memphis opened up new opportunities, but did not immediately change the family's financial situation. Vernon and Gladys both worked, and the household remained careful about money. Elvis took odd jobs as a teenager to contribute. All of this is the background against which his later behavior makes sense. When Elvis had money, he had it in quantities that would have been unimaginable to the family he grew up in. But the reference point he carried for what money meant and what it could do for a person in a difficult situation came from those early years. He knew what a paid bill meant to a family that was struggling. He knew what it felt like to depend on the goodwill of people around you. People who were close to him said he never fully adjusted to the scale of his own wealth. Not in a troubled way, but in the sense that he never started thinking about money the way people who have always had it tend to think about it. It remained for him something concrete and practical, a tool that could fix a specific problem for a specific person. His faith also played a role. Elvis was genuinely religious throughout his life. He read widely on spiritual subjects, sang gospel music because he loved it rather than because it was commercially useful, and took seriously the idea that people with resources had some responsibility toward people without them. This was not a public position he promoted. It was something that showed up in how he lived. The combination of his upbringing, his mother's example, and his personal faith produced a person who responded to need in a direct and uncomplicated way. He did not need a system for it, he just did it when he saw it, the way he had watched people do it in Tupelo when he was young. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977, at Graceland. He was 42 years old. In the days and weeks that followed, the public response was enormous. Fans gathered outside the gates of Graceland in large numbers. News coverage ran continuously. Tributes came from musicians, politicians, and public figures across the world. The scale of the reaction reflected how significant his presence had been in popular culture for more than 2 decades. But alongside the public mourning, something quieter began to happen. People who had known Elvis personally, worked with him, or been helped by him started to talk. Not all at once, and not always in major publications or television interviews. Some of it came out gradually, over years and even decades, in memoirs, in documentary films, and interviews given to smaller outlets. Piece by piece, a picture emerged that was different from the one the entertainment press had constructed over his lifetime. The people closest to him spoke first. Members of the Memphis Mafia gave interviews in the months after his death that covered the full range of what it had been like to spend years in his orbit. They talked about his generosity in specific terms, not as a general character trait, but with actual examples, moments they had witnessed, amounts they knew about, people they had seen him help. These were men who had also watched him struggle, who had seen the difficult parts of his later years up close, and who were not presenting a cleaned-up version of events. Their accounts of his kindness existed alongside honest descriptions of his problems. Joe Esposito, who served as Elvis's road manager for many years, spoke repeatedly in interviews about the private giving. Esposito was in a position to know the details because he often handled the logistics. He knew when Elvis had covered a bill for someone, when he had sent money to a family in need, when he had bought something for a stranger at a store. His accounts were specific and grounded, and they matched what others said independently. Lamar Fike, another long-term member of the Inner Circle, gave interviews over the years that were notable for their honesty. Fike did not always speak favorably about Elvis. He was candid about the tensions that developed within the group, about the difficulties of working for someone with that level of fame and pressure, and about Elvis's personal struggles. But on the subject of generosity, Fike's account was consistent with everyone else's. He described it as something that was simply part of how Elvis operated, not something that required explanation or celebration. Staff members from Graceland also contributed to the record over time. People who had worked in the kitchen, on the grounds, or as drivers gave accounts in documentaries and books that described an employer who was aware of their lives outside of work. Several of them described specific instances where Elvis had helped them financially during difficult periods, covering costs related to illness, family emergencies, or other hardships. These accounts came from people who had no particular incentive to embellish. In some cases, they shared these stories reluctantly, feeling that the moments had been private and personal. Strangers who had been helped by Elvis also came forward over the years, though many did so only after considerable time had passed. A number of these accounts surfaced in the 1980s and 1990s, when documentary filmmakers and journalists were working to build a more complete picture of who Elvis had been. These individuals described encounters that had been brief but significant. A bill paid, a car given, a conversation that turned into unexpected help. Most of them said they had not spoken about it earlier because it felt private or because they were not sure anyone would believe them. What connects all of these accounts is a detail that appears consistently across sources that had no contact with each other. Elvis did not wait for recognition and did not appear to want it. People who thanked him described the response that was brief and slightly uncomfortable. A nod, a short reply, a quick change of subject. He did not return to these moments later or reference them in conversation. Once something was done, it was done. This consistency across independent sources is what gives the accounts their credibility. It is one thing for a single person to describe a generous act. It is another when the same behavioral pattern is described by dozens of people who observed it in different places at different times over a period of more than 20 years. What emerged from all of these accounts taken together was a portrait of someone whose private behavior had very little to do with his public image. The performer that the world watched on stage was carefully constructed and deliberately presented. The person that the people around him actually lived with was more straightforward. Someone who saw a need, responded to it, and moved on without making anything more of it than that.